There's a long-standing war between old-school NBA players and new-school analytics. Analytics have rapidly changed the way the NBA is played, with the proliferation of three-pointers, the increase of at-rim shots, and the steady decline of players who are allowed to shoot from mid-range. Nobody has embodied the old-school side of that war more than Charles Barkley. As an analyst, he has used his platform to rail against analytics more than any other personality.
I'm not worried about Daryl Morey. He's one of those idiots who believe in analytics. So, first of all, I've always believed analytics was crap. And I never mentioned the Rockets as a legitimate contender because they're not. And listen, I wouldn't know Daryl Morey if he walked in this room right now.
He has made his opinion clear. But how do analytics feel about Charles Barkley? Is Barkley just mad about analytics because they don't paint a clear picture of his career? Or do analytics actually show just how good Charles Barkley was? My name is Mike. I'm the host of the Timeline podcast, and I'm going to take a look at the long-standing war of Charles Barkley versus analytics and find out just how analytics feel about Charles. Charles Barkley was one of the best scorers of his generation. It's clear he was good at putting points on the stat sheet. In his prime, he had 5 seasons of more than 25 points per game, 9 seasons of over 23 points per game, and 11 seasons of 20 plus points per game. That's all well and good, but we know how analytics works. Was it actually good per possession? Was it actually efficient? Should he have been shooting different shots? You may have heard this stat before. Charles Barkley is the worst three-point shooter ever. This is a widely written about and widely touted stat when people talk about Charles Barkley. He's not much of a shooter. A more speculative man may even guess that this stat being bandied about is one of the reasons Charles Barkley doesn't like analytics or even jump shooting teams.
And I told you, if they win the championship, I will get on my knees and congratulate the Golden State Warriors, but I do not believe they're going to beat these teams. That's just my opinion.
Check, respond.
So knowing this stat, you would venture to guess that Charles Barkley wasn't very efficient, right? Well, you'd be wrong. Not only is Charles Barkley efficient, he's one of the most efficient high-volume scorers not only of his era, but of all time. Of every player who has ever scored 20 points per game in a season, Charles Barkley is only beat in true shooting percentage by a single player, and that player is Steph Curry. That's right. The 2-time MVP, widely known as the most efficient player ever, is the only one to beat Barkley in an efficiency analytic. Not only that, Charles has 3 of the top 6 most efficient scoring seasons of all time, and 4 of the top 11 by true shooting percentage. True shooting percentage is one offensive stat, but what do others say about Chuck? Well, here's one. Offensive rating. Basketball Reference defines O rating as the number of points produced by a player per 100 total individual possessions, or how many points is a player likely to generate when he tries? See all those math formulas? That's probably what turns off people like Chuck. But how does it rate him? Well, for single seasons of players that have scored more than 20 points per game, Charles has 3 of the 5 best offensive ratings of all time, higher than any season by Steph Curry, LeBron, or even Kevin Durant. These stats love Charles. In fact, it's difficult, if not impossible, to find an advanced stat for offense that would paint Charles Barkley in a bad light. Had analytics been more widely prevalent when Charles was a player, maybe he would have been looked at as one of the best offensive players by a long shot, or had he played in the so-called analytics era, and his shot selection would have been more conducive to efficiency, it's possible that his all-time great offense could have been more efficient. Charles Barkley wasn't just an all-time great offensive player. He was also known as one of the better rebounders of his era. At power forward and what was likely 6'4", regardless of how he was listed, what he did on the boards was all but impossible. At the time, Charles was known as the slightly pejorative nickname, the round mound of rebound. Do the analytics agree with that sentiment? You know they do. Comparing rebounding across different eras is not great if you don't use advanced statistics. The amount of possessions has drastically shifted between eras, efficiency changes, the amount of available rebounds, and just using box score stats to compare doesn't really tell the full story. The way analytics nerds got around that is rebounding percentage. The rebound percentage is a stat that calculates the total percentage of available rebounds a player is able to secure while on the court. This helps normalize rebounding numbers across eras. Charles is listed at 6'6", which is a lie, but I still looked at all players ever at his listed height or lower and sorted by total rebound percentage. I also filtered by players who played at least 25 minutes per game to make sure we were only talking about great players here and not DeAndre Liggins or Steve Bardo. When you do that, you get this. Charles Barkley has 11 of the top 13 rebounding seasons for any player at his height or smaller. Once again, 11 of the top 13. This stat alone signifies that he is mound for mound the greatest rebounder of all time. This is another analytics stat that loves Charles Barkley and another opportunity to picture him in today's era. Had he played in the analytics era, the pace would be much faster and his rebounding numbers would be even more absurd. The last thing I wanted to look at here is what I call catch-all stats. These stats are made to measure overall impact on the court and look to give a singular number to help when comparing players. These stats are not perfect by any means. They're relatively flawed. They also favor modern players because modern players play with these stats in mind, but I still wanted to use some of them to help compare Charles to players from his era to make it a little bit more fair. By Charles Barkley's third year in the NBA, he was already fourth in both box plus minus and VORP, two catch-all stats, and only some very familiar names were above him in Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, and Magic Johnson. Throughout his prime, and from that season until his MVP season, he never dropped below fifth in the entire NBA in those stats. He even peaked multiple times at second in the NBA, only second to Michael Jordan. Even as other players above him changed and varied, he stayed steady at the top of the league. The truth is, I wanted to make a just how good was Charles Barkley video, but I figured there was enough of those. This experiment was meant to pit Charles against his greatest enemy, analytics, and see what comes out. It turns out, no matter how Charles feels about analytics, the analytics love him. They paint a picture of a player that is likely even better than his ringless reputation may reflect, and had analytics been used to rate players in his era, it's possible he would even be more appreciated now. Charles was a completely unique athlete in a completely unique era of the NBA, and as I said on Twitter, he was as big as Zion, as athletic as Russell Westbrook, and as efficient as Steph Curry. So while modern role players are attacking his legacy, let his body of work do the talking and maybe use his enemy, analytics, to make the point for him. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe to our channel if you'd like to see more videos. Don't forget to look for the timeline of Phoenix Suns podcast on your podcast app.